Sige, let's have a review of our previous lesson before tayo mag-move on. We are still in the testing hypothesis na lesson. So, included dito, ang first test na na-discuss natin for hypothesis testing is the z-test. Okay? So, balikan natin yung ating z-test. We have two types of the z-test, the one sample mean and the two sample mean. Sa one sample mean na z-test, you will be using this if you have idea or you have an information about the population mean. So, pag na ay population mean, then you will be using the one sample mean z-test. Kasi isang sample lang ito, tapos i-compare mo lang siya sa given na perceived population mean. And then you will also use this if you have the standard deviation. So most likely the standard deviation should be for the population. However, there will be times that the population standard deviation will not be available. So you can use as a substitute the sample standard deviation. Now, before talking about the one-tailed and the two-tailed, let's talk about first the z-test for two sample means. So, ang kaibahan niya sa one sample mean is ito, dalawang samples ito drawn from the same population. So, you will not have an information here about the whole population. Instead, you will have two groups of samples, but they are taken from the same population. So, mauna siya ang imuhang i-compare. Okay, so just like our example last time, na the whole population is the College of Arts and Sciences, and then we have two samples here. The first one is taken from the BS Psychology department, and then the other one is taken from the AB Broadcasting. So dalawang samples, silang dalawa yung i-compare mo. That's when we use the z-test. Dalawang sample from the same population, you will compare both means, and then you will be using this one. So the z-test is most likely applicable if you have more than 30 na samples for each group. Okay? And then yung sa one sample test, do not forget na you will be comparing two means, but the first mean will be coming from the population, from the whole population, and then the other mean na imuhang i-compare is the sample mean. So, mo na ang ilahang difference. Now, when you have computed the z-scores, you will be comparing it to the critical values na naa sa atuang table. So the level of significance, dalawa lang ang binigay ko sa inyo kasi itong dalawa ang pinakaginagamit na level of significance, the 0.01 and the 0.05. Okay? And then, you will decide whether the test will be a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test. So, unsa ako ang giingon ani sa inyo ha? How will you know if it's a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test?
If naay direction, ma'am, like
Kung naay direction, it should
mga
be
keywords nga more,
And may mga
something
keywords,
like
ma'am.
that. May mga more, true.
More, less, or greater.
Yeah. So that is correct, class. That is correct na before deciding whether it's a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test, you have to review the statement of the problem. Okay? Or you have to review the question, the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis to be exact. Sa null hypothesis, you will see there if the hypothesis is directional, meaning na siya direction, and then kung asa siya padulong, and then you will see keywords like greater than, less than, more than, lesser than, kana na mga terms would tell you na there is a direction here. Like boys are unsa ba to nga po ang example last time? Nakalimot ko sa ko example. Let us see. Yeah, this one. But this one is non-directional. Let's go back sa directional. Wala di ko nagbutang. Anyway, so ani na lang. Boys and girls do not differ in mathematics ability. So kana siya nag-ingon nga walay difference ang mga babae ug ang mga lalaki. Okay? So this one is non-directional. Wala siya direction. Bisan pag himuon nimo ni siya og alternative hypothesis, tanggalon nimo nang not din ha. Boys and girls do differ in mathematical ability. Non-directional gihapon siya. Moingon man siya na ay difference or walay difference, basta nag-ingon basta wala gani nag-ingon kung asa dapit ang difference nila, non-directional na. Automatic that will be two-tailed test. Pero, for example, ang imuhang hypothesis is boys have greater mathematical ability than girls. So, ingana ang imuhang hypothesis. Mas taas daw ang ability sa mga lalaki in terms sa mathematical ability ha kaysa sa mga babae. Then, ang tawag nato ana directional hypothesis. Na ay direction and it's in favor sa mga lalaki. Nga naga-assume ta na mas taas ang ilahang mathematical ability kaysa sa babae. Directional hypothesis na siya and it means you will be conducting a one-tailed test. So I hope nakuha ninyo ang difference. Pag maingon siya nga na ay difference pero wala siya wala niya gi-state kung paano nag-differ ang duha ka things or duha ka tao or duha ka group of people, then non-directional test na, non-directional hypothesis. So you will be doing two-tailed test. Pero pag, again, na ay direction, meaning in favor ka sa isa ka thing or isa ka group of people, meaning mas taas or mas baba ang ilahang ability or whatever is ang imuhang gina-measure na ay direction, so one-tailed test ang gamiton. So I hope that is clear. Any question? Kadot lang hana lang ko i-close. Sige, questions pa. Asa padapit dinhi ang dili masabtan? How about sa computation? Kaya lang? Kaya raman siguro, especially the z-test na one sample. This is just a simple computation. All you need to do is to get first the difference between the mean of the sample and the mean of the population. And then i-multiply nato siya sa square root sa ato ang sample size. And then divided by the standard deviation. Na. Do not forget our decision rule here ha. If the computed z-score is greater than the z-score or the critical value nga naa sa ato ang table, then you have to reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, accept the null hypothesis. That's the same thing with the z-test for two sample. Mas taas lang ang iyahang formula. Okay? So mas taas iyahang formula kasi you have here two groups or two samples. So the first thing you need to do is to get the difference between the samples, I mean the means from the two samples. So mean of sample 1 minus mean of sample 2 divided by the square root of the di ba ako ni siyang gihatagan o correction na you will use s squared if the given is the standard deviation. You need to square it kasi that will be your variance. Pero pag variance na class ang given, you don't need to get the square of the given kasi variance na yun, automatic variance na. Okay? Pag standard deviation, that's the time you get the square of this. So the same table ato ang gamiton and the same decision rule. Yeah, yes, Aliceya. Mostly given na ang tanan. Sa problem, given na siya tanan. You just have to state the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis based sa gihatag na problem. And then, i-compute na lang ninyo and you make your conclusion. So we ended here. Actually, wako kahuman ani nga slide. Wala na ako na-discuss si degrees of freedom. So si degrees of freedom, you will see this mostly sa mga statistical analysis, especially if you are doing hypothesis testing. Ang meaning aning degrees of freedom, it's the number of the independent sample, independent species, or independent pieces of information na gigamit sa pag-calculate sa atuang estimate or atuang critical value. So z-score man na or t-score man na siya, gamito nato si degrees of freedom. That is the number of information na gigamit when we do the calculation. So degrees of freedom also refers to the number of values that are free to vary. So kay daghan man kaayo tag samples. So among ato na mga samples, pag moingon kag degrees of freedom, mao to ang number of entities sa ato ang samples na pwede mag-vary from each other. And this is just also a very simple mathematics to get the degree of freedom. It is just n minus 1. So n refers to the number of items per set or the number of samples. So for example, na kay 30 kabuok nga sample, so 30 minus 1 lang, so 29 ang imuhang degrees of freedom. Meaning sa imuhang 30 ka sample, 29 ato ang pwede mag-vary from each other. Nakuha? Walang na siya ang degrees of freedom. So parehas sa ato ang example last meeting, we have 120 students from the BS Psychology and 120 from the AB Broadcasting. So kung mag-concentrate lang ta sa BS Psychology, that is just 120 minus 1. Okay? Kung sa psychology lang ha, pero kung sa ano lang po, sa AB Broadcasting lang po ta mag-concentrate, that is also 120 minus 1. So that is 119. The degrees of freedom is 119. And 119 kabuok ang pwede mag-vary from each other. That's degrees of freedom. But the degrees of freedom will be most useful pag abot nato sa t-test. Wala kaayo ginagamit si degrees of freedom sa z-test. Okay? But class, if you have two samples in your computation and you want to find a parameter like the mean, so you have 2n here to consider. So sample 1 and sample 2. Therefore, the degrees of freedom here is this one. This is how you compute this. Degrees of freedom is equal to n1 plus n2 minus 2. So pag duha ka samples, parehas aning atuhang example din. Himo to ingon ko kagaina nga pag mag-concentrate lang ta sa BS Psychology, then that's 120 minus 1. And then kung AB Broadcasting, 120 minus 1 gihapon. But if we consider the two samples here, kay gigamit nato siya sa pag-compute sa z-test, so naatay duha ka samples nga i-consider. So i-add lang nato na siya 120 plus 120. That's 240 minus 2. Okay, so the degrees of freedom will be now 238. So kaning first formula ginagamit lang ni pag nakay isa lang ka sample, just like sa z-test na one sample mean. Isa lang ang imuhang sample dito, so kani imuhang gamiton. But if you have two samples, then the degrees of freedom will be computed like this. N1 plus N2 minus 2. Pero again, di pa nato ni siya gamiton for the z-test. And then the critical value, actually the critical value are those values nga naa sa ato ang table. Okay? Diba we call it tabular value? Pero actually, it's most appropriately called the critical value. So this one is a point sa ato ang test distribution that is compared sa test statistic. Gina-compare nato siya dito sa ato ang gina-compute na mga values. And will help us to determine whether we are going to reject or accept our null hypothesis. So mani ang ato ang critical value ang ato ang ginasunod sa ato ang decision rule. So if the absolute value of our test statistic, ang meaning ana kay ang kanang na-compute nato nga value just like the z-score is greater than the critical value. Again, the critical value is those values nga naa sa ato ang table. Then you can declare statistical significance and reject the null hypothesis. Okay? So kanang critical value nato class that corresponds to our level of significance. So ang ilahang values are fixed when you choose the level of significance. Parehas atong naa sa ato ang table, if you choose the level of significance na 0.01, the critical value for the one-tailed test is fixed. That's 2.33. And then for two-tailed test, that's 2.575. Again, these are called the critical values which are related to the level of significance. So mao lang to akong wala na discuss last time kasi we ended with the examples sa two-tailed test. Questions so far before ta mag-start og new chapter? Mag-start og new chapter karon. Nagdali ko class because this is my last meeting sa inyo, ha? Questions?
Nan po.
Wala.